It's Codex Ansataku Sikimintavisi, A.D., inside a Danish longhouse. A messenger has just finished speaking. The silence that follows is absolute, suffocating, but the violence has already begun inside the minds of the four men listening. Four brothers sit around a wooden table. They are the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the most feared Viking who ever lived, and they've just learned their father is dead. Sigurd's snake in the eye, named for the serpent-shaped pupil in his left eye that makes him look perpetually possessed, is holding a small knife. He's idly paring his fingernails as if this is just another boring afternoon. As the news of his father's torture and murder sinks into his consciousness, he doesn't scream. He doesn't look up. He just keeps cutting with mechanical precision. He slices past the nail, through the skin, and carves straight down to the solid bone of his finger. Blood wells up immediately and drips onto the table. He doesn't even feel it. The pain of the flesh is nothing compared to what's happening in his mind. Across the table, his brother Bjorn Ironside, called that because men say he's never been wounded in battle, is holding a chess piece carved from solid bone. His massive fist tightens slowly around it. There's a sharp crack that echoes through the silent hall. The chess piece explodes in his grip like it was made of clay. Shards of bone drive deep into his palm, and blood begins to drip rhythmically onto the wooden game board, mixing with Sigurd's blood. This wasn't grief by any definition these warriors understood. This was a declaration of war. This was the exact second the revenge of the Great Heathen Army began. Before we dive deeper into this story of biblical vengeance that changed England forever, make sure you're subscribed to Maproom Battles. What you're about to witness is how four brothers systematically destroyed an entire country because one king made the fatal mistake of insulting them. Hit that subscribe button now, because this gets darker than you can possibly imagine. To understand this bloody reaction, you have to understand the magnitude of the insult. The messenger confirmed that King Aeya of Northumbria hadn't just killed Ragnar in combat like an honorable warrior. He had tortured him. He had thrown the legendary Viking raider into a pit filled with venomous vipers to die a slow, humiliating death. Stripped of his armor and his glory, Aeya wanted to prove to the world that Ragnar Lothbrok was just a man, not the demigod that legends claimed. But with his dying breath, even as the venom coursed through his veins and his throat began to close, Ragnar laughed at his killer. As the poison took hold, he choked out one final prophecy that would echo through the centuries, how the little piglets would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffered. King Aeya heard these words and thought he was ending a dangerous threat to his kingdom. In reality, he was lighting a fuse attached to the largest bomb in Viking history. He forgot one crucial detail that would cost him everything. The old boar had sons, and those piglets were now the most dangerous warlords in all of Europe. The reaction in Denmark was immediate and terrifying. There were no tears shed in that longhouse. There was no mourning period. There was only cold, calculated mobilization for war. Sigurd pulled the knife from his bone and wiped the blood on his tunic. Bjorn let the shattered chess pieces fall from his bleeding hand, and together they sent out a call that reached every corner of the Viking world, from Norway to Ireland. This would not be a raid for silver or slaves like their father used to lead. They didn't care about treasure or ransom. This was a mission with a single, brutal purpose: total extermination of everyone involved. Warriors flocked to their banner from Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Ireland. Ancient rivals put aside feuds that had lasted generations. Mercenaries refused payment just to be part of this legendary campaign. They were all drawn by the magnitude of the target and the promise of immortal glory. King Ea believed he was safe in his stone fortress across the North Sea. He had no idea that he'd just summoned a force unlike anything England had ever seen or would ever see again. The Great Heathen Army was preparing to launch, and they were coming to personally ensure that every single person involved in Ragnar's death would die screaming. Would you have the courage to face what was coming in late 865 A.D.? The sentry stationed on the coast of East Anglia looked out at the horizon and saw something that literally stopped their hearts. Usually, a Viking alarm meant 3 ships, maybe 5 at most. Fast hit-and-run raiders who would steal what they could carry and disappear before organized resistance could form. But this time was different. The horizon itself seemed to be moving toward them. Hundreds of dragon-headed longships cut through the morning mist, like a vision of Ragnarok itself. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a floating city. It was a migration of death with sails. Historians call it the Great Heathen Army, but the terrified Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply refers to it as the Mycel Heathen. Here, the Great Host. It wasn't just warriors with axes and swords. It was blacksmiths, women, children, horses, and entire families. They weren't coming to steal silver and leave within a week. They were coming to take the land permanently, burn the crops to ash, and dismantle the kingdoms of England, brick by bloody brick. And at the head of this massive force was not the strongest brother Bjorn, or the most stoic Sigurd. It was the cripple, Ivar the Boneless. History has debated for centuries why he was called boneless. Was it a brittle bone disease that made him fragile? Was it a complete inability to walk? Or was it a metaphor for his unnatural flexibility in combat? The sagas tell us he was often carried into battle on a shield by his warriors, like some kind of paralyzed prophet. But make absolutely no mistake, Ivar was the terrifying brain of this operation. While his brothers were fueled by pure rage and the desire to hack Ea into pieces, Ivar was fueled by something far more dangerous cold: mathematical cruelty. He understood that to kill a king like Ea, you didn't just need axes and courage. You needed strategy. You needed patience. You needed to think 10 moves ahead like a chess master. Ivar knew that Northumbria was too militarily strong to attack directly from the sea. The coastal defenses were too good. So he made a move that confused everyone watching. He didn't sail north toward Ea's kingdom. He landed his massive fleet in East Anglia, hundreds of miles south of his target. He deliberately bypassed his objective. Why? Because Ivar was playing the long game. He terrorized the locals of East Anglia, not into fighting back, but into immediate submission through strategic terror. He demanded horses as tribute. He turned his sea-borne infantry into a mounted cavalry force. He spent the entire winter gathering intelligence about the political situation, sharpening blades, and letting the fear of his presence drift north like a psychological plague. He was deliberately letting King Aella wait and wonder when the blow would fall. He was letting the dread build day by day. Ivar understood something profound about human psychology. The anticipation of pain is often worse than the pain itself. By the time the snow melted in the spring of 866, the Great Heathen Army was no longer just a mob of angry Vikings seeking revenge. Under Ivar's methodical command, they had transformed into a professional machine of war, mounted, supplied, organized, and hungry for blood. They turned their eyes north. The little piglets were done grunting. It was time to hunt the boar who'd hurt their father. While the Great Heathen Army was sharpening its axes and training in East Anglia, the kingdom of Northumbria was busy destroying itself from within. It was the perfect storm of circumstances. The Northumbrians were embroiled in a bitter, brutal civil war. King Ea, the usurper who killed Ragnar, was fighting a bloody conflict against the rightful king, Osbert, who claimed the throne was stolen. They were so consumed by their hatred for each other that they didn't notice the massive shadow creeping up from the south. Civil war is a gift to any invader, and Ivar the Boneless accepted it with open arms and a smile. In the autumn of 866 A.D., Ivar made his move. He marched the army north, utilizing the horses he had extorted from the terrified East Anglians. They moved with terrifying speed across the countryside, bypassing smaller villages and towns, aiming straight for the heart of the north, the ancient Roman city of York. But Ivar didn't just choose the target carefully. He chose the timing with brilliant precision. He waited for November 1st, All Saints' Day. Consider the cold brilliance of this timing. On All Saints' Day, the entire noble class of Northumbria, all the military commanders, and the bishops would be gathered inside the cathedrals and churches. They would be unarmed, distracted by religious ceremony, and deep in prayer. They were expecting a feast and divine protection from heaven. What they got was the heathen army. The Vikings struck York while the church bells were still ringing their holy songs. The city's defensive walls were manned by skeleton crews because everyone assumed no attack would come on a holy day. The gates were breached before the Northumbrian leaders even finished singing their hymns. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre inside a sanctuary. By the time the sun set on All Saints' Day, the capital of the north had fallen without significant resistance. But Ivar didn't burn York to the ground like a common raider would. That would be the mistake of someone thinking short-term. Instead, he occupied it strategically. He repaired the crumbling Roman walls. He stocked the granaries with food. He turned York into a fortified Viking fortress deep in enemy territory. He sat on King Ea's throne and waited with infinite patience. He knew that the fall of York would force his enemies to stop fighting each other and unite against him. He was counting on it. He wanted Ea and Osbert to join forces. He wanted them to bring their combined armies to the walls of York for a final confrontation. Why hunt the mice across the countryside when you can put down a piece of cheese and wait for the mice to come to the trap? It took 4 long months for the proud Northumbrians to swallow their pride. 4 months of watching a heathen army sit comfortably in their capital city, eating their food, sleeping in their beds, and openly mocking their Christian God. Finally, in March of 867 A.D., King Ea and his rival Osbert shook hands and made peace. They combined their forces into a single massive army. It was a crusade before the word would truly exist in that form. They marched on York absolutely convinced that God was on their side, ready to drive the pagans back into the sea. They were about to learn a terrible lesson about the difference between faith and strategy. On March 21st, 867 A.D., Palm Sunday, The Northumbrians attacked York with religious fury. At first, it genuinely looked like a crushing victory. The Northumbrians slammed into the old Roman walls of York with the desperate fury of men fighting for their homeland and their god. They found gaps in the defenses that seemed almost deliberately left open. They broke through the gates with battering rams. A massive cheer went up from the English ranks. They poured into the city streets by the thousands, flooding the narrow alleyways of York like a human tide, thinking they had the Vikings on the run. But they didn't understand who they were fighting. They didn't understand the mind of Ivar the Boneless. Ivar hadn't lost control of the walls through incompetence. He had deliberately abandoned them. He had invited the English inside his trap. As soon as the bulk of the Northumbrian army was squeezed into the tight, winding medieval streets of the city, the trap snapped shut with brutal efficiency. The Vikings appeared on the rooftops with bows. They emerged from side streets and alleys with axes. They locked their shields at both ends of the main avenues, turning the entire city of York into a claustrophobic kill box. The advantage of superior numbers vanished instantly. In the close quarters of urban combat, the long spears of the English levies were completely useless. It became a brawl of axes, knives, and desperation. The panic set in immediately throughout the English ranks. The Northumbrians were packed so tightly in the narrow streets they couldn't swing their weapons properly. They were systematically butchered where they stood, unable to retreat or advance. King Osbert, the rightful heir to the throne, fought bravely to the end. But he was cut down in the chaos. His body was trampled into the mud of the city he'd tried to save. The crusade had turned into a slaughter. But amidst the carnage and the screaming, the Vikings had received very specific orders from Ivar. There was one man who was absolutely not to be killed in the fighting. The sons of Ragnar were watching the battlefield carefully, scanning the faces of the dying, looking for one specific crown, one specific target. King Ea saw his army disintegrate around him. He saw his rival, Osbert, die. He realized with dawning horror that the walls he had just breached with such triumph were now his prison. He tried desperately to retreat back through the gates, but the path was completely blocked by a solid wall of Danish shields. He was surrounded on all sides. He was dragged violently from his horse, stripped of his weapons, and forced to his knees in the mire of blood and dirt. The Battle of York was over in less than an hour. The silence that returned to the city was broken only by the groans of the dying. The Vikings didn't execute King Ea on the spot. That would have been mercy. And mercy was not on the menu. Instead, they bound him in heavy chains. They looked at him not with anger or rage, but with a terrifying sense of anticipation. The war was finished. The ritual was about to begin, and King Ea was about to discover exactly what the little piglets had become. Would you want to know what's coming next? Or would you rather die in ignorance? The Great Hall of York had seen many kings over the centuries, but it had never seen a trial quite like this. King Ea was dragged into the center of the room. He was covered in mud and blood, his royal robes torn to shreds, his crown long gone. Around him stood the victorious chieftains of the Great Heathen Army, hundreds of battle-hardened warriors. But Ea's eyes were fixed on the four men sitting on the dais like judges at the end of the world, the sons of Ragnar. Bjorn Ironside sat with his massive arms crossed, looking at Ea like a butcher looks at a side of beef hanging in his shop. Ubba played casually with the handle of his battle axe. Sigurd Snake in the Eye watched with that unnerving, unblinking stare that made men feel like prey. But the most terrifying presence in the room was the man who couldn't even stand up on his own legs. Ivar the Boneless lay on a pile of furs, his twisted legs useless beneath him, but his eyes burning with a cold, reptilian intelligence that seemed to see straight through flesh to bone. This was the moment when the prophecy came full circle. Aea looked at them and finally understood what Ragnar had meant by the little piglets. But they were not piglets. They were wolves. They were monsters he had created by killing their father. Historical records don't give us a transcript of what was said in that hall, but the sagas paint a picture of terrifying intimacy. Ivar didn't scream at the prisoner. He didn't rage or threaten. According to the stories, he spoke softly, almost gently. He asked Aea about the pit. He asked about the snakes in detail. Did my father cry out? Did he beg for his life? How long did it take for the venom to stop his heart? Did you watch the whole time? Every question was a knife twist in Aea's gut. Ivar was forcing the king to relive his crime, to admit out loud that he had killed a legendary hero without honor. Aela had denied Ragnar a weapon to die with like a warrior. Now, Ivar would deny Aea a quick death. In the Viking code of honor, a clean death, a decapitation, or a sword thrust to the heart was a mercy. It was respectful, even to an enemy. But Aea had forfeited his right to any respect. He was not a prisoner of war, deserving honorable treatment. He was a criminal who had violated the sacred laws of conduct between warriors. There was no negotiation for ransom, no offer of exile if he paid enough gold. Ivar signaled to his guards with a slight movement of his hand. They didn't drag Aea to a dungeon. They dragged him out to a nearby hill overlooking the city. The time for words was over. The sons of Ragnar had decided on a punishment that would echo through history for over 1,000 years. They were preparing to perform a method of execution so horrific that, for centuries afterward, scholars refused to believe it was even physically possible. They prepared the ground for the Blood Eagle. The location was carefully chosen, a high ridge, visible to both the Viking army camped below and the terrified survivors of York cowering in their homes. King Aea was forced onto his stomach on the cold ground. His hands and feet were staked into the earth, stretching him taut like a piece of leather being prepared for tanning. He was no longer a king. He was a canvas for Ivar's masterpiece. Are you sure you want to know what happened next? Because once you know, you can't unknow it. The Blood Eagle, or Blathern in Old Norse, is perhaps the most infamous method of execution in all of human history. For a long time, serious historians argued it was just a myth, a scary story told to frighten children and enemies. But for King Aea, on that cold Northumbrian afternoon in March 867, it was physically, agonizingly real. The executioner, likely Ivar himself or a specialist specifically chosen for his surgical precision, approached with a long, sharp knife. This wasn't a clumsy hacking or amateur butchery. It was anatomy. It was art. First, the skin of Aea's back was sliced open, with two long, curved incisions made along either side of the spine, running from the shoulder blades down to the lower back. The skin was peeled back like flaps of parchment, exposing the layer of red muscle beneath and the white cage of the ribs. At this point, King Aea would have been screaming in a way that stripped his throat raw. But consciousness cruelly, would have remained. The victim needed to be awake for the ritual to have meaning. Then came the hammer and chisel. This is the part that defines the torture and separates it from simple execution. The executioner didn't just cut flesh, he systematically deconstructed the body, one by one. The ribs were severed from the spine. Crack, crack, crack. The sound of snapping bone echoed across the silent field where hundreds of Vikings watched. The ribs were then forced outward, bent back brutally to resemble the spread wings of a bird. The man was being turned inside out. His skeleton was being displayed. But the ritual wasn't finished yet. With the chest cavity now open to the air, the executioner reached inside the still living body. The final act was to pull the lungs out from the chest cavity and drape them over the broken ribs like some kind of grotesque decoration. As the lungs collapsed and fluttered with the dying man's final ragged breaths, the movement of the red tissue looked like the beating of wings, a blood-soaked eagle trying to take flight from the ruin of a man's body. Medical experts today suggest that Aya likely died from traumatic shock or pneumothorax, the collapse of the lungs, before the process was fully complete. But the Vikings believed that if the victim cried out during the ritual, he would not be allowed to enter Valhalla. Aella screamed. He died not as a warrior, but as a sacrifice to Odin himself. His body was transformed into a grotesque symbol of Viking dominance and justice. When the deed was finished, Aza's body was left there on the hill as a warning to every other king in England. The debt was paid. The old boar had been avenged. His sons had kept his prophecy, but as the sons of Ragnar wiped the blood from their hands, they realized something unexpected. The rage hadn't subsided. The adrenaline was still pumping through their veins. Ea was dead. But there were other kings in England. There were other potential targets. And the Great Heathen Army was still hungry. Why stop now, when conquest was so easy, with Ea dead and Northumbria effectively broken? A normal army would have declared victory and gone home. They had their revenge. They had their justice served cold. Mission accomplished. But the Great Heathen Army didn't turn back toward the sea in Denmark. They turned south toward more kingdoms. The taste of blood had made them hungry for more. In 869 A.D.M.O., they returned to East Anglia, the kingdom where they had first landed 4 years earlier. King Edmund of East Anglia had given them horses back then, hoping to buy his safety and neutrality. He thought he had a diplomatic deal that would protect his people, but Ivar the Boneless didn't honor deals with men he considered prey. When the Vikings returned to East Anglia, they didn't politely ask for more horses or supplies. They demanded the entire kingdom. King Edmund was a deeply pious man, a devout Christian who refused to fight a war he knew he couldn't win, but also refused to submit to a pagan overlord and betray his god. He was captured near the town of Hoxne, and here, Ivar decided to make another public example. If Eaza's death was about anatomy and the surgical precision of torture, Edmund's death was about archery and volume. According to the Passion of Saint Edmund, Ivar ordered the king to be tied to a large oak tree. He said he wanted to see if the Christian God would actually save his faithful servant. The Viking archers lined up in formation. This wasn't an execution by firing squad where death comes quickly. It was torture by volume and time. They fired volley after volley of arrows, but they didn't aim for the heart or the head. That would be too quick, too merciful. They aimed for the arms. the legs, the shoulders, the thighs, anywhere that would cause maximum pain without immediate death. The chroniclers wrote that Edmund was eventually shot with so many arrows that he resembled a hedgehog. His body was bristling with wooden shafts, pinned against the bark of the tree, bleeding from dozens of non-fatal wounds simultaneously. Throughout the entire ordeal, Edmund refused to renounce his Christian faith. He kept calling out to Christ and praying. This actually infuriated Ivar. The boneless commander had no patience for martyrs who wouldn't break. Bored with the game and annoyed by Edmund's continued defiance, Ivar gave the final order. A swordsman stepped forward and severed Edmund's head with a single powerful blow. Then, to prevent his followers from burying him properly, they tossed his severed head deep into the thick brambles of the forest. King Edmund the Martyr died not because he killed Ragnar or even offended the Vikings. He died simply because he stood in the path of the avalanche. His death sent a crystal-clear message to the remaining kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia. There is no negotiation with these men. There is no neutrality. You either die screaming like Aela, or you die praying like Edmund. But either way, you die. The Great Heathen Army was an unstoppable force of nature. Could anyone possibly stand against them? By 874 A.D., the Great Heathen Army had effectively decapitated two of the four great kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. Northumbria was a puppet state, ruled by Viking-approved lords. East Anglia was a graveyard. Next on the systematic conquest list was Mercia, the massive kingdom in the Midlands that controlled the heart of England. The king of Mercia, Burgred, looked at the fate of Aiea with his blood eagle. He looked at the fate of Edmund turned into a hedgehog. He saw the writing on the wall in blood. He realized that the sons of Ragnar were not men you could negotiate with diplomatically, nor were they men you could beat militarily. So King Burgred made a choice that history has judged very harshly. He didn't fight. He didn't pray and stand firm like Edmund. He ran as the Vikings advanced on his capital at Repton. Burgred simply abdicated his throne. He took as much gold as he could carry on a ship and fled to Rome like a coward. He died there years later, an exile, buried far from the land he was sworn to protect. It was a pathetic end to a once proud lineage. The Vikings didn't even have to unsheathe their swords to conquer Mercia. Fear had done all the work for them. Now look at the map of England carefully. It's almost entirely under Viking control. Only one kingdom remained independent and unconquered, the Kingdom of Wessex in the south. Wessex was the last stand. If it fell, England would cease to exist as an Anglo-Saxon nation. It would simply become a western extension of Scandinavia. The Great Heathen Army knew this. They turned their full attention to Wessex with the weight of an avalanche. But in Wessex, they found something they genuinely hadn't encountered before. They didn't find an arrogant tyrant like Aiea, or a passive martyr like Edmund, or a coward like Burgred. They found a young man named Alfred. At this time, Alfred was not yet the Great. He was a sickly prince, plagued by chronic stomach pain, often overshadowed by his warrior brother King Ethelred. But Alfred possessed a weapon that even Ivar the Boneless had to respect: a brilliant tactical mind. When the Vikings attacked Reading in 871, the battles were brutal and inconclusive. The losses on both sides were catastrophic. Unlike the other kingdoms, Wessex actually bit back hard. But the sheer numbers of the Viking invasion, bolstered by a second wave of invaders known as the Great Summer Army, were overwhelming. When his brother died in battle, Alfred took the crown in the middle of a war zone. He looked at the exhausted state of his army and did something that seemed unthinkable. He paid the Vikings to leave. He gave them a massive tribute of silver, known as the Danegeld. Critics might call this cowardice, similar to what Burgred did. But there was a key difference. Burgred paid to save his own skin and then ran away. Alfred paid to buy time. He knew he couldn't defeat the Great Heathen Army in a pitched battle yet. He needed to reform his military, build ships, and study his enemy's tactics. He was buying 5 precious years of peace. As the Vikings took the gold and settled into their conquered lands, believing Wessex was pacified and no longer a threat, Alfred sat in the dark watching, planning, and waiting for his moment. The sons of Ragnar had killed the torturers. They had conquered the weak. But now they were facing the architect of their downfall. In 873 A, the Zean. After the execution of King Edmund and the conquest of most of England, the most terrifying man in Europe simply vanished. Ivar the Boneless disappears completely from the English historical records. He leaves the Great Heathen Army in the command of his brothers and fades into the mist like a ghost. For centuries, this sudden silence puzzled historians. Did he retire peacefully? Was he killed in some unreported skirmish? Did he return home to Denmark to find the answer? We have to look across the Irish Sea to the annals of Ulster, Irish chronicles kept by monks. Here, Ivar dramatically reappears under the name Eymar, identified as king of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. It seems that after systematically breaking the back of the English kingdoms, Ivar returned to his stronghold in Dublin to rule as an emperor of the North. He had bigger ambitions than just England. But the gods are known for their cruel irony. Ivar the Boneless, the man who personally engineered the Blood Eagle, the man who turned entire cities into slaughterhouses, did not die a warrior's death. He wasn't cut down in glorious battle. He didn't ascend to Valhalla with a sword in his hand covered in enemy blood. In 873 A, the realm, the Irish annals record that Ivar died of a sudden and horrible disease. The man whose mind was his greatest weapon, but whose body was always a burden, was finally betrayed by his own failing physiology. It's a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for a figure of such legendary violence. He died in his bed in Dublin, likely surrounded by looted gold and silver, but defeated by his own biology. No saga was written about his final battle because there wasn't one. However, legend offers a different, more haunting ending, one that fits the myth better than the prosaic history. According to Viking folklore passed down through generations, before he died, Ivar gave specific instructions. He ordered his body to be transported back to England. He gave detailed instructions to be buried on the coast at the very spot where the Great Heathen Army had first landed to begin their invasion. His prophecy was that as long as his bones remained in English soil guarding the coast like a sentinel, no foreign invader would ever successfully conquer England. It said that for 200 years, his curse held true. Viking raiders came and went. Danish kings tried to claim the throne. Saxon struggles continued, but none could truly take the entire island while Ivar watched from his grave. The legend concludes dramatically in 1066, when William the Conqueror prepared to invade England from Normandy. William was superstitious, despite being Christian. He'd heard the old stories of the boneless guardian. The saga claims that William actually found Ivar's burial mound through local guides. He dug up the corpse, which remarkably had not decayed, and burned it to ashes on a massive pyre. Only after Ivar's physical form was completely destroyed did William feel safe enough to launch his conquest. Whether he died of disease in Dublin or kept watch as a skeletal sentry on the English coast, Ivar's legacy was undeniable. He'd come to avenge his father. He left having destroyed 2 kingdoms, executed 2 kings, and fundamentally altered the DNA of Britain forever. The little piglet had grown into a monster that devoured the old world. But with the monster gone, the survivors were left to pick up the pieces and rebuild. The war of vengeance was over. The war for the future of England was just beginning, and Alfred was preparing his counterattack. When the screams finally faded and the smoke cleared, the map of England had been permanently redrawn. The revenge of the Great Heathen Army was a complete tactical success. They had systematically hunted down every single man responsible for Ragnar Lothbrok's death. King Ea was a bloodied ruin on a hill. King Edmund was a headless martyr in a forest. The north and the east of England belonged entirely to the Vikings. But revenge is a strange thing. It starts as a fire intended to burn your enemies, but it often ends up forging a completely new world. The Vikings didn't just kill the kings and leave. They stayed. They settled. They traded their swords for plows and their ships for farms. The lands they conquered became known as the Danelaw, a massive territory where Viking laws, customs, language, and culture took deep root. If you walk through the streets of York today, or examine place names ending in by or Thorpe across northern England, you're looking at the direct echoes of this invasion. Ragnar's death didn't just lead to the death of Ea. It led to the hybridization of an entire culture. The blood of the old Viking boar and the blood of the English kings mixed in the soil to create something entirely new. Ragnar Lothbrok died alone in a snake pit, laughing at his killers, believing his sons would bring glory to his name. And they did. But they also brought something else that he couldn't have foreseen: chaos. And out of that chaos, the Anglo-Saxons were forced to evolve or die. They needed a leader who was more than just a warrior with a sword. They needed a visionary. The Great Heathen Army thought they had won the war permanently, but in the shadow of their victory, hiding in the swamps of Wessex, the young King Alfred was done paying them off with silver. He was done watching and waiting. He was building the very first English navy from scratch. He was designing a network of fortified towns called burhs. He was preparing to do what everyone thought was impossible: to push back the tide. The sons of Ragnar had their vengeance served cold. But the question remained, could they hold what they had taken through violence? The answer would determine whether England survived as a nation or disappeared into Scandinavia. And that answer was coming. But let's talk about what this story really means beyond the blood and the revenge. The Great Heathen Army's invasion of England in 865 represents a critical turning point in European history that most people don't fully appreciate. This wasn't just about killing a king or conquering territory. It was about the collision of 2 completely different civilizations. The Vikings represented a pagan warrior culture that valued personal honor, martial skill, and blood vengeance above all else. The Anglo-Saxons represented an emerging Christian feudal system that valued written law, centralized authority, and religious unity. When these two worlds collided, neither could remain unchanged. The Blood Eagle execution of King Ea is controversial among historians to this day. Some argue it never actually happened, that it was propaganda invented by Christian monks to make the Vikings look barbaric. Others point to similar execution methods in other cultures and argue it was real. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Whether the Blood Eagle was performed exactly as described or was a myth created later, it served a purpose. It terrified people. It sent a message that could not be ignored. And in medieval warfare, psychological warfare was often more effective than actual combat. The Vikings understood this instinctively. The story of the Great Heathen Army also teaches us something important about the nature of revenge. The sons of Ragnar achieved everything they set out to do. They killed their father's killer. They conquered his kingdom. They left his body as a warning. By every measure, they won. But what did they actually gain? They got temporary satisfaction and permanent enemies. They created a situation where Alfred of Wessex had no choice but to become a military genius just to survive. Their revenge ultimately created the conditions for the rise of England as a unified nation. So did they really win? This is the paradox of revenge. It feels necessary. It feels justified. But it often creates more problems than it solves. The sons of Ragnar were trapped by their own success. They conquered so much territory that they couldn't effectively control it all. They spread themselves too thin. They made too many enemies simultaneously. And in doing so, they gave Alfred the time and motivation he needed to build something that would eventually drive them out. The Great Heathen Army's greatest victory became the seed of their ultimate defeat. This pattern repeats throughout history. Overwhelming military success often contains the seeds of future failure. Are we seeing that pattern repeat today? There's another crucial lesson from this story: the importance of institutional knowledge versus individual brilliance. Ivar the Boneless was a tactical genius. Under his leadership, the Great Heathen Army was nearly unstoppable. But what happened when he died or left? The army continued to win battles. Yes, but they stopped thinking strategically. They became raiders again instead of conquerors. They focused on short-term gains instead of long-term control. Alfred understood something the Vikings didn't. Systems beat individuals. A great system run by mediocre people will eventually beat mediocre systems run by great people. Alfred built systems: the Bourse, the feared militia, the navy, the administrative framework. The Vikings relied on individual warlords and their personal charisma. When those individuals died, their achievements often died with them. This is relevant today. In business, in government, in any organization. The question is always, are you building something that depends on you personally, or are you building something that can outlast you? The Vikings built empires of personality. Alfred built institutions. Guess which one lasted? There's also a fascinating question about cultural adaptation. The Vikings who settled in the Danelaw gradually became Christian. They intermarried with the Anglo-Saxons. Within a few generations, they were barely distinguishable from the people they'd conquered. Was this a defeat or an evolution? The Viking culture didn't disappear. It merged and transformed. This happens with every conquest in history. The conquered influenced the conquerors. Roman culture didn't disappear when Rome fell. It was absorbed by the Germanic tribes, who then became the Holy Roman Empire. The Mongols conquered China, but within a generation. The Mongol Khans were essentially Chinese emperors. Cultural conquest works both ways. The Great Heathen Army conquered England militarily, but English culture eventually conquered them. Who really won? The answer isn't as simple as it seems. This has implications for how we think about cultural change today. When new ideas or technologies or values enter a society, we often think in terms of resistance or acceptance. But the reality is more complex. Cultures don't replace each other, they merge, creating something new that combines elements of both. The modern English are neither pure Anglo-Saxon nor pure Viking. They're a hybrid, and that hybrid became stronger than either parent culture. This is the real legacy of the Great Heathen Army, not the Blood Eagle or the conquests, but the genetic and cultural mixing that created modern England and eventually influenced the entire English-speaking world. Ragnar's sons thought they were destroying England. They were actually creating it. Let's talk about leadership styles, because this story offers a masterclass in different approaches. King Ea represents authoritarian leadership through fear. He thought he could intimidate his rivals by killing Ragnar in the most humiliating way possible. But fear-based leadership creates enemies who never forget and never forgive. The sons of Ragnar represent leadership through personal charisma and shared mission. They united disparate Viking groups around a common purpose: revenge. This is incredibly powerful in the short term. People will follow you to hell and back if they believe in the mission. But what happens when the mission is accomplished? The Great Heathen Army started falling apart after Ea was dead. King Alfred represents something different: leadership through vision and institution building. He didn't just fight the Vikings. He created a framework that would continue fighting them after he was gone. He understood that defeating the Great Heathen Army wasn't about winning one battle. It was about building a nation that could withstand any invasion. Which leadership style is best? The answer is, it depends on the situation. Crisis requires charismatic leadership. Ragnar's sons were perfect for rallying a revenge army. But building something lasting requires institutional leadership. Alfred was perfect for creating England. The key is knowing which type of leader you need to be in which situation. There's also the question of proportional response. King Aella killed one man, Ragnar. The sons of Ragnar killed thousands in response and conquered half of England. Was this justified by Viking standards? Absolutely. By any objective standard, that's harder to say. This is the problem with vengeance as a guiding principle. It has no natural stopping point. One death avenges another, which requires more vengeance. In an endless cycle. The only way to break the cycle is for someone to have the courage to not retaliate. But in a warrior culture, that courage looks like cowardice. It's a trap with no easy exit. Alfred eventually broke the cycle by being strong enough to fight, but wise enough to negotiate. He made peace with the Vikings not from weakness but from strength. He showed them that continued war would cost them more than they could gain. This is the art of strategy, making your enemy realize that cooperation serves their interests better than conflict. The Great Heathen Army ultimately failed not because they weren't fierce warriors, but because they never learned this lesson. They only knew how to conquer, not how to govern. They only knew how to take, not how to build. And in the long run, builders always defeat takers. Are you a builder or a taker in your own life? One more thing we need to discuss: the role of religion in this conflict. This wasn't just a political war. It was a clash of gods. The Vikings worshipped Odin, Thor, and the Norse pantheon. The Anglo-Saxons were Christian. Each side believed their gods would ensure victory. The blood eagle wasn't just torture, it was a religious sacrifice to Odin. King Edmund's refusal to renounce Christianity wasn't just stubbornness, it was faith. Both sides fought with religious certainty. Both sides believed God or the gods were on their side. Both sides were willing to die for their beliefs. So who was right from a historical perspective? Christianity won. Within a century, even the Vikings and the Danelaw had converted. Does that mean the Christian God proved superior? Or does it mean Christianity was better suited to organizing large societies? Or does it mean religion adapts to political necessity rather than the other way around? The Vikings converted not because they were militarily defeated, but because Christianity offered advantages. It connected them to the broader European economy. It legitimized their rule in Christian eyes. It provided a legal framework for governance. The conversion of the Vikings wasn't a spiritual victory. It was a practical adaptation. This pattern repeats throughout history. Religions that successfully combine spiritual meaning with practical benefits spread. Those that don't disappear. The Norse gods didn't lose because they were false. They lost because they couldn't provide the institutional support that Christianity offered. This is uncomfortable for true believers on either side, but it's the historical reality. Today, we see similar dynamics, ideas, movements, and systems that combine emotional appeal with practical utility spread. Those that offer only one or the other struggle. The lesson isn't about which god or ideology is true. The lesson is about what actually helps people survive and thrive in changing circumstances. The Great Heathen Army's failure to convert England to paganism wasn't a failure of their warriors. It was a failure to offer an alternative institutional framework that could compete with Christianity. They could conquer, but they couldn't convert. And in the long run, hearts and minds matter more than swords and axes. So what's the final takeaway from this epic saga of revenge? Conquest and cultural collision. The Great Heathen Army achieved everything they set out to do. They killed their father's killer in the most brutal way imaginable. They conquered most of England. They established the Danelaw that lasted for centuries. By any objective measure, they succeeded. But they also failed. They failed to permanently hold England. They failed to convert the English to their religion. They failed to prevent the rise of Alfred and the eventual reconquest. Within a few generations, their descendants were Christian Anglo-Scandinavians, barely distinguishable from the people they'd conquered. So, was it success or failure? The answer is both. The Great Heathen Army teaches us that victory and defeat aren't binary opposites. They're complex outcomes with unintended consequences. Ragnar's sons got their revenge, but revenge turned out to be hollow. They conquered England, but England conquered them back culturally. They won the battles but lost the war of civilization. This is the paradox at the heart of all military history. Military victory is easy to measure. Cultural victory is not. The Romans conquered Greece militarily, but Greek culture conquered Rome intellectually. The Mongols conquered China militarily, but Chinese culture absorbed the Mongols. The British conquered India, but Indian independence movements eventually expelled them. Power dynamics are always more complex than they first appear. The Great Heathen Army looked unstoppable in 870 Vir by 950 1. They were a footnote. The lesson: short-term dominance means nothing without long-term adaptation. The Vikings who thrived were the ones who adapted to English culture while contributing their own innovations. The ones who clung to pure Viking identity disappeared. Thank you for joining me on Maproom Battles for this journey into one of the most violent revenge stories in history. If you enjoyed discovering how four brothers changed England forever through systematic conquest, hit that like button and subscribe. I want to hear from you. Do you think the Blood Eagle was real or myth? And do you think revenge can ever truly be justified? Let's discuss in the comments. And if you want to see how Alfred the Great managed to defeat these seemingly unstoppable warriors and earn his title, make sure your notifications are on for our next video. History isn't just about the past. It's a mirror showing us who we are today. Until next time, remember, victory is temporary, but consequences are permanent.